Alright, guys. So, I hope before we begin today's lecture that you've watched that documentary 2 Days in October, because it is really the best documentary on what it was like for the United States in the Vietnam War. Because in that snapshot of 2 days in October 1967, we can see the problems of war fighting in Vietnam, the problems of a government that is so desirous of good public opinion that's going to outright skew the figures, okay? But at the same time, okay, a public that the rise of student activism, what we're going to see is the children, these are the baby boomers coming of age. And what we're going to see is for them, they in many cases they don't understand, well, World War II happened. World War II is the worst conflict in human history, yet the problems are still going on. And so for them, they said, okay, well, our parents did not stand up and were not activists in stopping it, so we are going to be. And that then is the major shift. So what we're going to see is with the Vietnam War, this is going to cost the United States much of its international standing. And what we're going to see is this is the ultimate byproduct of the Truman Doctrine. The ultimate byproduct of containment, the idea of containing communism where it is, doing everything we can to keep the status quo from changing. And what this is going to do is, as decolonization begins to happen, we'll talk about that after Vietnam. Okay, the United States is impotent to stop this because we're so caught up with Vietnam. And at this point, people are not listening to us, that now decolonization is going to be a problem largely for Europe, but one that we're going to nonetheless be faced with in the future. So why do we get involved in Vietnam? It's the other side of the planet. Well, remember when we talked about Dien Bien Phu and the Geneva Accords way back in 1954, okay? And we had talked, I don't know why I'm saying okay a lot, that's apparently my thing. But we had talked about how once France realized it could no longer regain Indochina after World War II, they turned the problem over to the United States. But the United States does not comply with those Geneva Accords. We don't let those free elections happen to unify the country. And the reason we don't is, again, the domino theory, which I believe I've mentioned it at least a couple of times. I'm sure Gaddis has mentioned the domino theory. But the domino theory is pretty much this, okay? The idea is simple. If country A goes communist, then the countries around it go communist. Then the countries around that go communist. Imagine, if you will, rows of dominoes, and as one tips and falls, it tips and falls, tips and falls, and on and on and on. And so people were legitimately worried in the 1960s. And much like this thing, better to fight in Vietnam than in Honolulu. This would have been, a popular phrase at the time. The theory was simple. If North Vietnam is allowed to spread communism to South Vietnam, then it will infect Indochina. It'll spread to the Philippines. Then it will spread to Australia, then Papua New Guinea. And then communism, in this kind of just amorphous blob, is going to hop a boat up to Hawaii. And then once commies are in Hawaii, they're going to go link up with the commies that are already in California. And then from there, the United States is communist. So even though this sounds particularly stupid today, okay, the theory was, in essence, if Vietnam goes communist, the United States goes communist. Is that actually going to happen? Of course not. Is that what Ho Chi Minh wants? Of course not. Minh is a nationalist, okay? Ho Chi Minh is a nationalist. He wants a unified Vietnam. That's all he wants. But we're so paranoid about the expansion of communism that the Korean conflict, 1950 to 53, we go in, we fight it. We're going to do the exact same then here. And so what this means is, for better or for worse, the United States is going to prop up a ruthless, brutal dictator in the form of Ngo Dinh Diem, the one-time ruler of South Vietnam. And what we're going to see, we're going to lose who we are as a country, what we think we are, what we envision ourselves doing. I'm going to post some videos that I hope you watch. I hope there's some John Wayne fans. And one of the videos I'm going to post is A Nation Builds Under Fire. And what this was an mid-1960s public service announcement type thing. It was a small short film shown on TV where John Wayne literally goes to Vietnam, interviews people, and makes the case for the United States fighting in the war. And his idea is simple. We're trying to build up South Vietnam. We're trying to turn this into a freedom-loving, democratic people, much like we were. And so what we're going to see is, it's the most cringeworthy thing from that movie, and why you need to watch it, is John Wayne talks about how, the communists, this is my John Wayne accent, the communists seem to think we don't know anything about guerrilla war. Well, they forgot 1776. Yeah, and the guerrillas won in 1776. No, John Wayne, shut up. You're getting it wrong. But it's this whole thing of at the time, okay, the Johnson administration believed in everything that they were doing. But also understand this. This is not the product of one American administration. Because what we're going to see is in 1957, we get the beginnings of the Viet Minh insurgency in South Vietnam. The communists begin fighting in South Vietnam, trying to destabilize the government to push either for an invasion or possibly just complete unification of the country. We're going to see routine terrorist bombings in Saigon, as many as 400,000 assassinations. And it's under John F. Kennedy's presidency, we're going to get Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson touring Vietnam, meeting with Ngo Dinh Diem. That's what's actually happening here. This is not Johnson as president. This is simply Johnson as vice president. And what Johnson says, coming out of this, is that Diem is a beacon of freedom and that we need to do everything we can to try to prop him up. Okay? I think he said something, in fact, likening him to the Winston Churchill of Asia, something to that effect. Now, what we're going to see is one of the things that historians love to debate. And for those of you that are history majors, this is technically a counterfactual hypothesis. This is something we're not supposed to do. What if the Nazis won World War II? What if, I had asked that girl for a date in high school? What if blah, 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 blah? Because there's no way to know the answer, okay? Actually, if it's the girl dating in high school, the answer would have been no. But no, I'm not bitter, not at all. But what we're going to see, okay, is one of the favorites is that, if JFK had survived, if John F. Kennedy had not been assassinated in November 1963, that maybe the United States would not have gotten into the Vietnam War. I disagree. I disagree because Kennedy was already escalating American aid. We were already sending tanks, advisors, weapons, equipment. We were already sending air support by 1962. We had not committed ground troops. But if the same events had happened, I personally don't see any change in results. That's my own personal belief. It's under Kennedy. We're going to get one of the things that will already doom any chance of American victory in the Vietnam War. And I hate to spoil this for you, but we're going to lose this one. Okay, this is literally thousands of Americans are going to die. Millions of dollars are going to be spent. Our popularity across the world is going to be shattered, and we get nothing for it. The best example I can get of how I plan to teach Vietnam is this. A few years ago, when I taught my U.S. since 1945 class, it was a night class in Tulsa, and I was going on about the Vietnam War. One of the non-traditional students said, "Dr. Prince, you make us sound like assholes in Vietnam." If that's not the idea that you get from this and the succeeding lectures, I didn't do my job right. Because we are assholes in Vietnam. And we're literally everything that we perceive ourselves as what we should do. We sidestep that and we lose ourselves out of fear of communism. The first thing we do that's going to screw us over is the 1961 Operation Strategic Hamlet, which doesn't sound stupid. The whole idea is this. We want to try to protect the average Vietnamese peasant. Okay, this is a very peasant-based society. Your average Vietnamese citizen, okay, has no concept of being a citizen, no concept of belonging to a larger South Vietnamese government. He's tied to the land. He cares only about his village, this land that was his seemingly time immemorial. Okay, it was his father's uncle's brother's former cousin's roommate. I mean, literally, this has been in the family for years. And what we're going to see, though, okay, is what the United States does to protect these people is wants to construct fortified positions. That's what this is. This is a strategic hamlet. And if you see what are apparently 4 walls, redoubts. The idea is they want to make this defensible so that communist guerrillas, the Viet Cong, cannot attack. So that communist sympathizers can't come into the village and try to woo anybody. But there's a problem. The villages, as they have been in Vietnam, are not set up with defensive positions in mind. They're not set up, in the case of this, such as on an elevated rise where you can control the countryside. They weren't thinking that in 1066 when the village was first established. So what the United States does is go to villages in South Vietnam. Go to the people we're supposedly trying to protect. And one of the concepts we're going to get into later this week, and then when we come back from the break, is the idea of hearts and minds. That I want to win your hearts and minds so that you by playing to your heart, you and your mind will support the American cause. That we're going to make you be anti-communist. We're going to make it where you will not even admit there is anything good about the communist position. I can talk today. So what do? Imagine, if you will, let's assume you live in, I want to create a strategic hamlet in my hometown of Skytook, Oklahoma. I choose that because I don't think any of you are from there. If you are, I'm sorry. Well, what I'm going to do, how many of you live in Tulsa? How many of you live in Enid, Oklahoma City, here in Stillwater? Well, what good does a strategic hamlet in Skytook, Oklahoma do you? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into Tulsa and I'm going to forcibly evacuate you. I'm not going to give you a choice. I'm not going to say this is for your own good, so you should do it. I'm going to come in with an M16, okay, and I'm going to say, get your stuff. We're moving you to Skytook. Then I'm going to come to Stillwater, and with that same M16, I'm going to beat down your door and say, all right, we're moving you to Skytook. Then I'm going to go to Enid and do the same thing, in Oklahoma City and do the same thing. What I am doing, ostensibly it's to protect you from the communists, is taking you away from your ancestral homeland. Taking you away from land that has always been yours, and I'm in effect putting you in a commune. As I'm talking about this, and I've never made this connection before, this is almost like the reservation system of the American West. Okay? I'm taking you from what's yours, what's always been yours, what's been yours since forever, and moving you in effect to a reservation where I can watch you. I'm telling you it's for your own good. In fact, I believe it's for your own good. But as the Vietnamese peasant, all you're getting from this is that here is somebody who is white-skinned, I am not white-skinned, from the other side of the planet, taking me away from my homeland. What are the communists offering? Okay, sure, they've got this bunk about Karl Marx, they've got this stuff I don't believe in, but if Ho Chi Minh's running the show, I still have my land, I still have my crops, I still have everything that was mine 5 years ago. And what we're doing, by trying to stop the spread of communism, all we're doing is making allies of the communists. We're ensuring we'll never win the hearts and minds of the people because we are now perceived as the invaders. We are now perceived as the ones coming in, ripping them out of their homeland. And this is a massive problem. Now, the South Vietnamese government loves this idea because for the South Vietnamese government, this is how guys like Ngo Dinh Diem are going to exert control, are going to make it where people know that he is the leader of South Vietnam. And as this is very clearly starting to not work, what we're going to see is that Kennedy will begin to push for his overthrow. We had been supporting. Once it turns bad, now we're going to overthrow. And how we're going to have the ability to do this is, again, we're pumping all sorts of equipment into South Vietnam. In 1955, right after Dien Bien Phu, we create the Military Assistance and Advisory Group, MAG. And then what we're going to do under this is begin training a new South Vietnamese army. An army that is anti-communist, that is pro-United States, equipped, trained, run exactly as an American army. Okay, ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Okay, that's what South Vietnam called itself. On February the 8th, 1962, we're going to see that MAG will be stopped, and we're going to create MACV, or Military Assistance Command Vietnam. And MACV is going to be, it's going to escalate the crisis. This is February the 8th, 1962. Now we're going to send more and more advisors, laser. And the reason I air quote advisors is many of these advisors are going to serve almost as battalion commanders. Okay, not just training, but leading some combat operations. Because the idea is we're training the enlisted rank and file, but ARVN officers have no idea what the hell they're doing. Because in many cases, ARVN officers were badly trained. It's a corrupt system. It's, quite literally, instead of, okay, you've been in the service this long, or or you fought this many battles, or you have this education. To be an officer, it was a question of how politically connected were you to Diem? Or if your father was a general. Congratulations, son. Here's a battalion. I'm 23. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Too bad. Go figure it out. So understand, although we're using the term advisors, okay, they are significantly more than just someone saying, here's how to shoot a gun, here's the business end of a rifle, here's what you do. These are almost acting as a substitute officer corps. This is 1963. This is why I say I think Kennedy still would have gotten us in Vietnam. Simply because he's not exactly backing down. Johnson will be the main guy, okay, throughout the majority of the Vietnam War. But Kennedy is certainly escalating the crisis. Diem, however, is going to fall. And when he falls, he's going to create one hell of a power vacuum. Again, he's a brutal dictator. He's pioneering strategic Hamlet. He has no problem letting ARVN troops commit wanton murder of anybody suspected of being communist. And we're going to see one of the most famous, and this is horrifying, incidents in which a Buddhist monk immolates himself in Saigon in June of 1963 in protest. Just lights himself on fire. If you want to know, okay, the position of the Diem government, it's simply this. In reaction to this, his wife, Diem's wife, the First Lady of Vietnam, issues a public statement. Does she say it's horrible? No. Does she say we've got to make changes? No. Does she commend the guy for his bravery? No. What she says is hopefully the next time a monk does this, they'll have the good sense to tell us to bring marshmallows beforehand. Completely tone deaf to the fact a man has literally burned himself alive because he felt so strongly against what this government's doing. Now comes American meddling. Okay. The Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front, are growing stronger. Because what's happening, and this is Civics 101, okay? I am freedom fighter, terrorist, National Liberation Front, whatever you want to call it. I'm pissing off the government. The government becomes more repressive to try to stop me. All it does is create more allies. The more repressive the government is, the more people it makes sympathetic to, the NLF's cause. That's exactly what happens. As Diem, in some cases, massacres whole villages. As Diem acts brutally and heavy-handedly, that just drives more and more people into the camps of the Viet Cong. And so what happens is the leaders of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam grow dissatisfied. And on the 1st and 2nd November 1963, Guys under the control of Duong Van Minh assassinate Diem. I think they kill his wife. I think they kill the VP. And they are going to seize control. Now here's the thing. The Central Intelligence Agency of the United States knew that the man we have been backing, okay, which if you note the Time magazine, note how the flag has been ripped in half. We're not actually conceding that North Vietnam is a country. That's why part of it's communist, part of it's, like an American flag. The man we have been propping up, we know is going to be assassinated. Do we stop it? Hell no! The CIA just steps back and lets it happen. And what this is going to do, okay, is this is going to create a power vacuum in South Vietnam. But one of the most hilarious things that nobody could have, and I hate saying the word hilarious with an assassination, but this actually kind of is, was that the communists were shocked and horrified. The communists could not believe this. Why? Well, assassinating Diem was one of the worst things that could have happened to them, because Diem was their best recruiting tool. When monks are self-immolating, then that's going to send people in droves over to the side of the communists. Now their poster child has been removed. And so now they've got to find other ways to try to fix the problem. And so what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, well, let's step up our attacks. Let's maybe escalate the war, do more. Let's try to force a solution now. Let's tap into the fact there is going to be a power vacuum. Literally, in Vietnam, okay, through 1964, it's going to be a revolving door, because what's going to happen is so many people just come in, okay? It's literally government, nope, deposed. Government, nope, deposed. It's like ancient Rome, okay? What is it? The year of the 5 emperors, okay? That's literally what we're talking about. And so the communists step up their attack. And we get a fateful incident on August the 2nd, 1964. The American destroyer Maddox is patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin off Vietnam. Okay, by this time, Johnson has taken over. And Johnson has stepped up American military presence in the region. And what's going to happen is on August the 2nd, 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attack an American destroyer. We have photographic evidence of this. Now here's the thing. This means nothing, okay? An American destroyer can easily brush off torpedo boats, okay? This was literally, I mean, come on. This is not going to be that much of an issue. But what we're going to see, though, because of 7 governments in 64 alone, okay? I've actually got a typo on this slide. It should be August 2nd, 1964. 2 years, I haven't fixed it. Sorry. But what we're going to see, though, is why they do this is they're becoming more emboldened. They hope expand the war, cause a conflagration, either drive the United States out or commit the United States fully so they can get more aid from the communists. And that's exactly what Johnson wants to do. Johnson wants to go full on into the war. And here's again where the United States begins to cast off everything we have worked for since 1789. We need to go, who declares war? Well, it's Congress. Congress has to approve war. The president can ask for a declaration of war. The president can ask to send troops. But what happens, though, is Congress must be the ones to actually do it. And what we're going to see is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who many Vietnam War vets to this day still hold a grudge against, has the realization that 3 NVA torpedo boats, North Vietnamese torpedo boats, attacking 1 American destroyer is not enough for a war. It's simply not enough. So what happens is he fabricates an attack. The attack on August 2nd of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is a legitimate attack. The one that many old histories would talk about, and that McNamara himself, August the 4th, was completely faked. It never happened. The United States government outright lies about an attack on the United States Navy so that Congress can pursue what was called at the time the Fight If We Must resolution. What this simply said in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was that Congress was going to give the president, in effect, a carte blanche, a blank check, that he could do whatever he needed to do to protect American interests, okay, to protect affairs in Southeast Asia. And what they do is, we've talked about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, it has a mirror organization, SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And what this resolution says is that the president can do, spend, call up troops, send guys, whatever, to help any Southeast Asia Treaty Organization member. And South Vietnam happened to be a member. This is the start of the Vietnam War, and it's based on a false flag operation. Please, treat everything suspect. Okay, and that's the thing about history. What is history? To quote Napoleon, history is the version of events people have decided to agree upon. We can see Winston Churchill's view of history. History will be very kind to me, for I intend to write it. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing the fact that this did not happen, but it's going into the history books as two attacks. First on the destroyer Maddox, the second on the destroyer Turner Joy, but the Turner Joy was never attacked. There was no second attack by Vietnamese torpedo boats. But it's enough that the United States gets embroiled in Vietnam. So what I want to do now is let's take a step back and let's put this in the context of the Cold War. We've already been fighting in Vietnam since 1962. American air support had already been helping ARVN units, had been helping units with American advisors. All we're doing is stepping up combat operations. We're going to see that just as the Marshall Plan had bound the United States then to the problems of Europe and created an entangling alliance, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution binds us to Southeast Asia. We're fighting in a place we don't want to, against an enemy we don't want to fight, all because, hey, we are afraid that if communism spreads to South Vietnam, okay, that it's magically going to somehow hop a boat and go to Hawaii. They're already voting Democrat anyway. Why is this a problem? I don't get it. We're going to see that as this is going on, okay, 2 months after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, China explodes its first nuclear device. And why this then is so important, okay, is now we're going to be fighting in Vietnam, which borders China. Okay, so once again, like Korea, this in theory could escalate. But what we're also going to see why this is important is, again, the Sino-Soviet split. Remember how we talked about how China, by this point, by 1961, is denouncing the Soviet Union, calling them traitors to Marxism. Well, what that means is China now wants to see itself as the arbiter of international communism, of doing what it can to help everything. And so that means, much as, rifles like this, that Chinese Type 53, which is the copy of the Soviet Mosin Nagant. This one, remember, had been sent to Albania, okay? But the Chinese are going to send lots of this stuff to the North Vietnamese. No, and understand, this, more than Korea, is going to be a slugfest between capitalism and communism. The Soviets are going to send rifles, jets, tanks. The Chinese, tanks, rifles, jets, equipment. Czechoslovakia is going to send rifles. In fact, most of the Warsaw Pact nations are going to send stuff like this, especially these older things, like these older World War II era carbines, or like in this case, I don't know if you can, you can't see it, but December 1953, this is obsolete, but it'll work in South Vietnam. And so what we're going to see is the whole communist world is going to pour aid into North Vietnam. And again, this war, except for the airstrikes, is not going to be fought in the North. It's going to be fought in the South. So the United States now has to send more and more troops. The United States now has to send aid and equipment. The South Koreans, in response to the United States having come into Korea, they're going to send stuff. The Australians and New Zealanders who are worried about that domino map, they're going to send stuff. And this becomes one of the larger and, unfortunately, the deadliest of the proxy wars. So deadly, I'm getting hiccups, in fact. There are some fears of widening the war, and it's precisely because of that. And widening the war, in this case, is not just from a Cold War perspective. Johnson, at this time, is doing what he calls the Great Society. Johnson is trying for progressive domestic reform. He doesn't have the money to fight both in Vietnam and do the Great Society. So Johnson's going to want to fight this war on the cheap. And that's simply not going to work. More than that, it's going to be disastrous for reasons we'll go into later. But suffice it to say, relying on chemical weapons, that's not a good way to make up troop numbers, especially if we're trying to say we're the beacon of freedom. Imagine what it looks like to the rest of the world as we drop Agent Orange, as we drop napalm, as we drop, just carpet bomb the hell out of Vietnam. And so what we're going to see, this is also a war that we don't understand to fight. I hate saying this, but the United States Army historically sucks at fighting guerrilla wars. We can see that with the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902. We're going to see the rise of atrocities there. There's a reason why we call it the First Vietnam. Because who are we fighting? By and large, in the first phase of the war, we're not fighting a uniformed, trained army. We're fighting these guys, the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists, or, as they were more known, Victor Charlie, by, the NATO alphabet. And the issue is, if you look, by and large, they're clad in the same black traditional clothes as the Vietnamese peasant. Which means, imagine I was wearing black pajamas, okay? I'm just a humble villager. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm just a humble villager. Now I have a rifle. Now I'm VC. Now I'm a combatant. But when I put that away, how do you know? How do you know if imagine yourself an American trooper going into, a Ville. It's a search and destroy operation. You've got to clear out caches of weapons. You want to try to destroy these carbines because you don't want, the VC mounting any sort of, operation. And you see all these peasants. How do you know? How do you know who is a civilian, who is not? Let's look at the case of this woman, okay, who looks like you're an average just civilian. But where did she get that M16? Okay, I'll tell you where. She killed somebody for it. But here's the thing. If she doesn't have the M16, how do you know? And so what's happening is this is a war where, we've been trained, understand, the Army has been training since 1945 to fight the Soviet Union in the Fulda Gap of Germany. Let's go back to all the stuff I've been saying the whole course. That the Soviets are going to invade East Berlin, or West Berlin. They can invade themselves, whatever. Then they're going to cross in force with more tanks than God through the Fulda Gap. And they're going to drive through to France. And that's going to lead to a toe-to-toe nuclear exchange. And then Dr. Strangelove, Mein Führer, I can walk, becomes a reality. That's what we've been training for. Not, is this woman a civilian or is she Victor Charlie? I don't know. The fact is we have not been training for that possibility. We're trained more to fight these guys on the right. These are regular NVA guys. Okay, they're clad in green. They have a semi-green or khaki. They have a semi-uniform performance. And what you can notice from these guys is, they look like they're equipped with Soviet stuff, but you can actually tell it's Chinese. The stick grenades are actually Chinese that are copies of the German Stielhandgranaten 24 from World War II that had been exported to the nationalists during the Sino-Japanese War, during the Chinese Civil War. There are AK-47s, or more appropriately AKMs, the AK modernized, have folding bayonets. That was something unique to the Chinese. But what we're going to see, though, okay, is what this means, though, is the United States is not prepared for how to fight a boots-on-the-ground war. We're used to something more conventional, something like this, what we do in the wake of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Operation Rolling Thunder. Let's treat this like it's Berlin, 1944, and bomb the hell out of them. And understand this. This, on the one hand, we're used to this. 1944, we're used to this. This in theory, should not, strike up any issues. But we didn't see it in World War II. We saw the pictures the Army released. But what you're happening now is Vietnam, understand, is what's called the living room war. Okay, what that means, remember that stuff we talked about in the 1950s about how most homes now had television sets? This means that what's happening is you can watch the war unfold live. Think of the time differential. Just as the battles would be going on in Vietnam, okay, just as, you'd have the casualty estimates and things like that, in the United States, that's about the time you're sitting home to dinner with not but 3 channels to watch. So, of course, you're going to watch the news. You can watch this unfold. So what we're going to do is a very American historic response. We're going to use our air power. This is how many people want to say we won World War II. In reality, the only time air power has ever won a war is if you drop nukes, and we can see that with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but nonetheless, this is what we want to do. February 13, 1965, LBJ announces Operation Rolling Thunder, and what we begin doing is bombing targets in North Vietnam, ostensibly military. We're not hitting the capital yet, and the idea is if we can show, this is almost like shock and awe, go all the way back to 2003, if we can show how powerful we are, the type of military force we can bring to bear, then maybe we can get the North Vietnamese to relent. After a month, by April, okay, Johnson begins offering economic aid. Okay, if you stop this war, if you pull out the Vietnamese communists, we will help rebuild your country, we'll give you food, we'll give you aid packages. But the North Vietnamese say no. And what we're going to see is the United States by 1973 will drop 7 million tons of bombs on Vietnam. 7 million tons of bombs. That is a stupid number. And there's a reason I'm searching on my phone because I want to double check this statistic. Oh, man. But 7 million tons of bombs. And again, we're fighting, in effect, we're fighting, what? In effect, a third world nation. Okay, this is not there we go. This is not a nation that, has reliable air defense. I mean, sure, they're going to shoot down American planes, but they're not going to be able to touch, really, B-52s. This is not a nation that is militaristic. This is not the same as the United States fighting Germany in World War II. This is not the United States fighting the Soviet Union. This is, in effect, a third world nation by at least our modern, if not the Cold War convention. But what is 7 million tons of bombs? Why is that so important? In the entirety of the Second World War, all of the Allied countries dropped on all of the nations that they were fighting 3.4 million tons of bombs. We are literally going to drop on Vietnam from 1965 to 1973 over twice the number of bombs that Britain and France expend in the entirety of the Second World War. Now let's take this a little further. Every year, today, 70 some odd years later, we find at least 2,000 tons of ordnance unexploded in Germany, left over from World War II. People are still getting killed, dozens of people a year, because they'll be farming and they'll drive over a World War II bomb they didn't know was there. If you're doing that with 3.4 million tons, what's going to happen with 7 million tons? This is absolutely asinine. But the hope is, if we can bomb from the air, we can send fewer troops. That is what our fervent hope is. Now, what's this going to do, again, from the perspective, then, of Cold War, of containment? Simple. As I said, you don't really see what's going on with You don't really see what's going on with World War II because, it's not right there. But imagine every night turning on your television station and watching B-52s just poop out, tons and tons of bombs. Some of them might be as small as 200 pounds. Others might be 1,000 or 2,000 pound bombs. Just carpet bombing. But watching that's not
Kennedy thought he could finesse the Vietnam
this,
situation with special forces and
watching rockets, napalms,
program,
and watching
LBJ's approach
just this country. And you're not seeing cities, you're not seeing
enough of
factories, you're
them,
not
they
seeing
would
troops.
The simplest way
We're
to kill them
bombing
was with
farmland. We're bombing villages. We're bombing huts. How the hell are we the good guys? And that's what people start to ask. And this is going to go on from 1965 to 1973.
Over that hurdle.
And so what people are going to start to say is, well, wait a minute.
The fourth quarter.
How are we better than the Soviets? Look what we're doing to a small nation. Okay, again, Vietnam has some air defense, but not that much. This is not an industrialized society. You're not seeing cities and bridges and industry.
That was how we killed the most people, both north and south.
But what you are seeing is farmland. That's napalm, by the way. That's what the students in that 2 days in October were protesting. And what you're seeing is we're literally just going to devastate South Vietnam. The title of this DVD is called American Holocaust, and that's unfortunately a true name. Because by the end of it, we don't have exact figures, but the estimates suggest that between 1 and 2 million South Vietnamese will perish because of the Vietnam War. I mean, this is just insanely deadly. Because understand, we're not bombing, not all of this, the majority of the bombing is not in North Vietnam. It's in South Vietnam. We're not bombing tank parks because they're not using tanks. Instead, it's a case of, okay, here's a village that we think is a suspected VC concentration. So we're going to bomb around it. Okay, we think it is, but we're just going to remove it from the map because we can't always send troops in on search and destroys. But we feel we have to do this. And so again, we talked about containment. So after Rolling Thunder, April 1965, we send 60,000 more troops. But at no point do we have a clear military strategy. Understand, that's one of the problems of the Vietnam War. Think of World War II. Think of from D-Day to... Well, no, just think of November 8, 1942, when we invade an Operation Torch. Put a map of Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and you can chart the progress of American troops. Okay, we're here in 1942. We're here in 1943. We're here in 1944. We're getting closer to Germany. We're winning the war. You don't have that in Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, it's largely a series of small unit actions, or maybe up to battalion or divisional scale, but it's not fighting for control of territory. It's more, again, search and destroy. Find concentrations of enemy and destroy them. All the while, the North Vietnamese, remember, they're keeping guys in Laos, in Cambodia. And the United States, until the 70s, doesn't want to intervene. We don't want to expand the war. Our stated goal is simply to keep communism out of South Vietnam. And we're afraid of what happens if this radically expands. But because we don't have a true military strategy, what we're going to see is the United States will get pulled in because we're going to make an American mistake. We're going to look at our superior firepower. If you've ever seen We Were Soldiers or read the book, here you go. And what is it? I said to learn how more actually died, about a month ago, I think. But the Battle of the Ya Drang Valley in 1965. This is the first major combat operation of the war for the United States. It's only the second major battle. There had been one earlier. But what's important about the Ya Drang is this is when the United States goes in full tilt. And what we're going to see is we're actually going to take fairly massive casualties. Because what happens, we airlift in guys. We're going to use new types of warfare. Use the UH-1, Huey helicopters coming in, landing squads of guys, evacing out. That way you don't have to slog all the way through the jungle. Okay? Bear in mind also, at this point, We're not bringing in most of our armored vehicles. Again, we don't want to escalate the war. But what we're going to see, though, is in this battle where an American cavalry unit, Air Cav, fights an enemy about twice to 3 times its number, American troops prevail. Because we have more air support, more artillery, more everything. We can just simply throw a weight of steel and drive back the Vietnamese. But this shows us exactly what the war is going to take on. This sets the tone for the rest of the war. The Vietnamese are always going to fight. They're not going to slack away from a battle. They'll, in many cases, take horrendous losses. But there's a reason why Ho Chi Minh purposefully styles himself as George Washington. Because Ho Chi Minh is a keen student of history. And he actually bases this on the American Revolution. Always fight the enemy, but don't let the army be destroyed. That's why George Washington will win. He keeps the army intact. Well, that's what Ho Chi Minh does. Keep the army intact, and the idea can persevere. So what we then see is that how then do you fight the war in Vietnam? And strategists begin to say, what about a war of attrition? The idea of the body count. Kill more of them than they kill of us. Okay. The only problem is, okay, as you saw from 2 Days in October, in many cases the numbers are going to be outright lies. They're going to be inflated. They're going to make us look good. But also imagine from the perspective of the American citizen who watches The Nation Builds Under Fire, which I'll post with this lecture, who watches John Wayne literally likening South Vietnam to the American colonies. And then all you hear, we killed 150 people today. We killed 1,000 people today. We killed 250 people today. How are we the good guys? This war is mismanaged from beginning to end, unfortunately, and it's going to show. One of the reasons why it's going to be mismanaged is, again, Johnson wants, he wants both a liberal agenda and a conservative budget. What do I mean by that? And I don't want to talk about too much of this because this actually gets more domestically. I just include it in case you wanted some background and you haven't taken one of my classes before. But pretty much what he wants to prop up the Great Society. He wants civil rights. He wants voting rights. He wants Medicare, Medicaid. But at the same time, he wants a balanced budget, which means it's hard to fight a war and have reform. So Kennedy had cut taxes. Johnson doesn't want to raise them. So what that means is Johnson has to try to fight the war on the cheap. And it's simply not going to work. You cannot fight a war 1 foot in, 1 foot out. This ain't the hokey pokey. You've got to go all in. And so what we see is Vietnam starts out as popular. Here's from New York, 1967. This is actually the same year as those student protests. This is actually a demonstration in support of the war of Vietnam. Of people saying, no, we want to fight the communists. We like this war. Tapping veterans, citizens, Asian people. We stand with your one idea, freedom. Communism is the enemy in Vietnam. Okay. Like literally, this was initially a popular war in some circles, but not where you guys are. Not where you guys are right now, not at the university. That's where people begin tripping up. And that's where we see the first actual instances where people did not support the war. Because what we're going to see is at the university, we're going to get what's called the teach-in, where university professors would literally host rallies, sometimes at midnight. And what they would do is say, okay, I'm going to sit here and go on and on and on and on, telling you why the war in Vietnam is bad, telling you why this is a problem, telling you why we should not get, into the war. They model it based on the sit-in of the civil rights movement. And so what we're going to see is Vietnam's just one of those really screwed up things. Liberals hated the war in Vietnam, but they loved the Great Society. Conservatives hate the Great Society, but they love the war in Vietnam. And so what we're going to see is Johnson has no base from which to draw support. And because he cannot get massive nationwide support, He's got to fight the war on the cheap, and because of that, we're going to resort to napalm, carpet bombings, dropping 7 million tons of bombs on the country. And what all of that's going to do is bring us no closer to victory while eroding our stance in the war. Now, what I want to do, just really quick, is understand this is not, when people think of war protests, we tend to think of Vietnam. When the war in Iraq was going on, I'm thinking Cindy Sheehan, who led, in many cases, the protest movement for the war in Iraq. But protesting war has been a common American thing. There's the Women's Peace Delegates, 1915, protesting World War I. There's the American Peace Mobilization that was literally scared of the United States getting involved in World War II. There's protests in the War of 1812. You've got Henry David Thoreau going to jail for, being an outspoken critic of the Mexican War. This has been a common thing. But what makes it different is this is the living room war. This is a war you can now watch unfolding. You can watch the protests. And so, whereas in the past, protests you could put in a paper or talk about on a radio and marginalize it, once you see it, okay, that makes it much more impactful. So understand, and I know I'm beating a dead horse, but with Vietnam, what's going to happen here is we go into this fully believing everything we've believed. For many cases, we don't think this is any different than Korea. But the fact is, to quote the title of a great book in the 1960s, the times were a-changin', things are in flux all across the world, Western civilization will come to the brink of societal revolution, and we're tone deaf to it, and that's going to be a massive problem. So I apologize that this lecture was kind of depressing. Again, it's Vietnam. I have to make it depressing. I can't do the Robin Williams Good Morning Vietnam. So what I will leave you with is this, to hopefully get a chuckle out of you. One of the things that's going to be critical with Vietnam is that Johnson has a skin about as thin as, this paper towel. In the sense, if you criticize him, he's just going to get really butthurt and explode at you. And why that's important is, he's going to alienate people over the Vietnam War. That's why he can't fully manage it. But he also has a really gruff personality. And I know no better way to show Lyndon Johnson's personality than to play a recording of him ordering pants.
Yes, sir. We're all together.
There's a reason I'm doing this.
Some real lightweight slacks that he just made up on his own, sent to me 3 or 4 months ago. It's a kind of a light brown and a light green.
I don't know who did the art for this, but
green
it's
and
amazing.
soft brown. Now, I need about 6 pairs for summer wear. I need about 6 pairs to wear around in the evening when I come in from work. And I can send you a pair. I want them a ½ inch larger in the waist than they were before, except I want 2 or 3 inches of stuff left back in there so I can take them up. I vary 10 to 15 pounds a month. So leave me at least 2.5, 3 inches in the back where I can let them out or take them up, and make these a ½ inch bigger in the waist. Make the pockets at least 1 inch longer. My money and my knife and everything fall out. Wait just a minute. Hello? Hello. Now, another thing, the crotch down where your nuts hang is always a little too tight. So when you make them up, give me 1 inch that I can let out there, because they cut me. They're just like riding a wire fence. These are the best that I've had anywhere in the United States. But when I gain a little weight, they cut me under there. So leave me, you never do have much margin there. Let's see if you can't leave me about 1 inch from where the zipper ends, round under my, back to my bunghole. All right, then. So I can let it out there if I need to. Now, be sure you got the best zippers in them.
And now that you've heard an American president say, down where your nuts hang, and back to my bunghole, that's all I've got for you today. So, again, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll be posting, probably today, the guidelines for the movie review assignment. So, it shouldn't be that detailed. So, just start thinking already what kind of movie you want to do. I might include a list, but pretty much most things between 1945 and 1991 have at least some aspect of the Cold War in them. So, and I mean, you could even do things like John Wayne's The Alamo, which in many ways is an allegory of the Cold War. You know, again, any movie where they're going to be playing up the plight of freed men, the 300 Spartans. I mean, clear Cold War allegories. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know. And please, do me a favor. When you go and get pants, literally, go to JCPenney or wherever and ask them about Down Where Your Nuts Hang. Alright, take it easy, guys. Have a good one. And I will see you in the next video.